Cleopatra was a black woman. Based upon modern standards, she would have definitely been a black woman. If you look at many women out there who pass for black today based upon conventional standards, such as Evelyn Lozada, Cardi B, Meghan Markle, Kamala Harris, etc., you see women who are not entirely white and have discernible traces of African ancestry. Based upon this metric, Cleopatra was definitely black. Now, I know that the woman I just mentioned would be called light-skinned preferences by the anti-colorist crusaders of the world, and that Cleopatra would be considered one of the first daughters of the trade in post-classical Africa by many of our expert students of Africana history. It is important to detail any potential African roots of Cleopatra. The father of the Ptolemaic queen Cleopatra, also known as Cleopatra VII, was Ptolemy XII, son of Ptolemy IX. Through his male line, Cleopatra VII was of Macedonian Greek descent. Cleopatra VII's mother is usually identified as her father's sister, Cleopatra V, a royal wife. Mention of Cleopatra Tryphena or Cleopatra V disappeared from the record around the time that Cleopatra VII was born. Cleopatra V, while often identified as a younger daughter of Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra III, may not have been the daughter of a royal wife. If this scenario is accurate, Cleopatra VII's maternal grandmother may be another Ptolemy or an African. If Cleopatra V died before Cleopatra VII was born, she could not be her mother. In that case, Cleopatra VII's mother would likely have been a Ptolemy or again, someone of African descent. The record is simply not conclusive as to who Cleopatra VII's mom or grandma were. They could have been of either or heritage. But let's take the position that Cleopatra was pure Macedonian. Would that make her lily white? Absolutely not. Most conservative scholars identify Cleopatra as completely non-African and of Greco-Macedonian and Persian descent. Both of these regions existed in the zone of confluence with many different neighboring populations trading and relating with them. Now, this is where a lot of these racial conversations get tricky because when we're talking about human beings, essentially all human beings are African if we go back to the Paleolithic time. But when we're speaking about modern time, especially the Megalayan or 4.2 thousand years, most of these populations that we're talking about outside of Africa would not necessarily be African. See, the Greeks and the Persians would have existed within the Indo-European universe. However, Cleopatra was one of the first Ptolemy rulers and elites to speak the Met-Remen-Kimi language, which means that from a linguistic perspective, she would have essentially been African. Though the Ptolemies exercised and expressed a lot of xenophobia against foreigners and people not considered part of their culture, there is some evidence that there was a Greco-Egyptian elite that emerged from the intermingling and mixing between the Ptolemies and local inhabitants of the African continent, particularly that Northeast African Happy River Delta. So even if Cleopatra was essentially Ptolemaic, we can't necessarily rule out African ancestry in her recent Ptolemaic heritage. Now let's examine some of the genetic evidence, because a lot of people out there are stating that there's no evidence of any type of African incursion into the Aegean or into West and Central Asia. If we look at African genetic markers, particularly these autosomal markers on the sequencing of human leukocyte antigens, certain Greek DNA markers link more with African groups such as the Amhara and the Oromo before beginning to approach other Mediterranean and Middle Eastern groups. There are also other infra-Saharan African traits that exist within the Greek populations, such as cystic fibrosis mutations that are typical of Black Africans. And this is according to the American Journal of Human Genetics. And here you can see a cladistic dendrogram showing relatedness between Mediterranean and so-called sub-Saharan populations. And these genetic distances between populations were calculated using human leukocyte antigen sequencing and genetic typing. As you can see, if you look at these populations, the Greeks cluster closer to the Amhara, the Oromo, the Fulani, and the Masi than they do to other so-called Mediterranean and European populations. So there's definitely some genetic evidence of some African ancestry and incursions within the Greeks and the greater Aegean. Now let's look at the general African haplogroup E. It appears in several European populations, notably Greeks and other southern Europeans in the Balkan zone. Haplogroup E originated in Africa. This is also true of its European subgroups in E3b. In Africa, this subgroup has 4 separate peak areas. These are in southern Africa, Morocco, northern Libya, and the Horn of Africa. The last 2 bear witness to the route from northwest Africa through Anatolia to Europe. The frequencies are relatively high also in Anatolia. In Europe, haplogroup E3b has peak values of about 25% in Albania. About equally high frequencies are also typical of some other parts of the Balkans and southern Italy. The E haplogroup reaches a high peak of about 25% in the Middle East and Mediterranean. It is a major haplogroup in infra-Saharan Africa and represents about 75% of all Y chromosomes. Europeans contain the E3b subhaplogroup, which was derived from an E haplogroup in infra-Saharan Africa and is currently distributed in North and East Africa, generally speaking. Now, if we examine the phylogenetics, we also find evidence of African ancestry among the Macedonians and the Greeks, particularly if we examine the African Y chromosome haplogroup EM35 and one of its subclades in EBY3A80 among the Macedonians and the Greeks. This is evidence, clear Y chromosomal, clear sex chromosomal evidence of African ancestry among the ancient Greeks and Macedonians. Based upon the preponderance of genetic evidence, it is clear that Cleopatra definitely had some recent African ancestry and would definitely be classified as black today using conventional standards.